Hello and welcome back to my channel. I wanted to show you today my new personal journal. I've literally just finished binding it. I've been without my own personal journal for a few weeks now. I put this together pretty quickly. For the cover, I used my felt method. So this is a felt based cover with different fabrics and linens all patched and stitched together. I've been making a bunch of journals in this soft style with the felt based cover recently. I've shared a few different videos and I've also sold some of those journals in my shop, and I promised you a tutorial. So this video is also going to be a tutorial on how you can create your own felt based cover just like this one. You just have to be able to sew and know how to sew just basic stitches. I used a sewing machine for all of the journals that I made, which is the easiest method. I guess in theory you could also hand stitch. So a sewing machine and some basic sewing skills are highly recommended. And yeah, if you want to learn how to make your own, just continue watching this video. I'm just going to give you a quick little flip through before the tutorial. As I said, I put this together as quickly as I could, so I didn't even do any sewing or anything extra in here. I've been spending a lot of time working on journals for other people and journals to sell in my shop, so I haven't had a lot of time to put into making a book for myself. So this was very quickly put together. I just went through and pulled out some of my favorite patterned papers and some of my favorite children's book pages, and then I mixed those up with some vintage paper and some craft paper. It's just a combination of a few different types of papers, and I think in the end it actually turned out way better than I expected. I have done 7 signatures. Each signature has between 4 and 5 pages each, so I wanted to make sure I had plenty of drawing room in this journal, which I certainly do. I'll be able to add a whole heap of stuff inside here. So I'll just give you a quick close-up of the different fabrics that I stitched together. Again, I just used stuff that I already had. I didn't go out and buy anything for this. I just went through my stash and I just pieced it all together. And I went with this kind of animal theme for this book. So we've got a little cat on the spine, and then there's also lots of like cute, semi-bright and maybe unexpected color combinations. I didn't want it to be very matchy, but we've got this beautiful little dog embroidery and then the horse embroidery on the back. This is an old piece of a vintage quilt, and then just several different trims sewn all around as well, with this lovely fabric for the lining. So I feel like the animal theme also ties in really well with the paper selections that I've chosen. These are some of my favorite papers that I've just been hoarding because I knew that I would want to include them in my own journal eventually. It's quite simple, but I feel like it all ties together really well and I can add to it. So this is like the basic journal. I feel like the next time you see this, there'll probably be some type of closure added to it, and maybe some extra bits and pieces as well, because as I said, I just wanted to get the basic journal finished as quickly as I could. If you'd like to learn how to create a felt based fabric cover, I'm going to have that tutorial up for you right now in this video. If you have any further questions that are not answered in the tutorial, you can just leave them in the comments down below. And yeah, I really hope that you will enjoy it and have a go at making your own. So step by step, the first thing you're going to need to make a journal like this is some felt, and we're using craft felt. And I'm lucky because I have a local store that sells really big sheets of craft felt, but you can use any that you have available to you. It doesn't have to be in this big of a sheet. I'm using white craft felt because then you don't have to worry so much about the color of the felt peeking through whatever fabric selections that you have. But it just depends like what fabrics you're using and what finished look you're going for. When you have your felt, you just want to measure out your cover pieces and your spine piece, and these are going to be 3 separate pieces. So instead of cutting the cover out in one large sheet, it's actually going to be in 3 different panels. So our front and back cover and our spine piece. You want to make your cover whatever size that suits you, and you want to make your spine piece a little bit wider than what the finished spine piece is going to be. So say if you want your spine to be 3 inches wide, I would add 1/2 inch measurement to that, because once we sew it all together, you're going to lose a little bit of that width. So they can be any measurements that you like though, but our front and back cover are going to sit over the top of the spine piece just slightly, which is why we need to add a little bit of width. Once you have your panels cut out, you also want to choose some fabric for your base. So this doesn't have to matter too much. It just depends how much of this fabric you would like to have peeking through. So when we get to the actual design and the fun part of decorating this cover. You can make it whatever you want to be. You could literally just cover it with one piece of fabric and not add anything else to it. It's completely up to you. For me, I'm going to be patching a lot of different fabrics and trims over the top of this, so I'm not too fussed about what that base layer is going to be. But the base layer is basically going to cover the entire felt so that you can't even really tell that the base is felt. It is going to cover the edges of the felt and the edges of the journal cover itself. So there's not going to be any raw edges, there's not going to be any raw fabric, and there's not going to be any raw felt seen as well. So this is going to cover up each panel individually, and to do that I'm basically covering this like you would with a book. I'm just folding in the corners as best as I can and then wrapping the fabric around and pinning it, and you can just keep readjusting those pins until you have all of your corners and edges covered as neatly as you can. Then you're going to repeat that with both the front and the back cover, and for the spine you're going to do the same thing. You're going to cover it up as best as you can. But with the spine, it can be a little bit easier because you don't have to worry too much about the long edges of the spine piece because they're going to be completely hidden once we finish making this book. So you'll see what I mean once you finish watching the tutorial. So it's just up to you. You can cover them as flush as you can, like I am in this tutorial, or if it's easier, you can just make sure that the top and bottom edge of your spine piece are really nice and neat and not worry too much about the long edges. Again, I'm just using my pins to pin this fabric down, and I'm just trying to make everything nice and neat and nice and snug, and I'm also trying to keep the bulk of the folded fabric to a minimum. So there are going to be some places on your book that are going to be more bulky than others in the end, but I'm trying to make sure that the fabric is as flat and flush as it can be. Once you have each piece covered with your chosen fabric, you can then go ahead and sew around the edges. And another thing I forgot to mention is you don't have to use the same fabric for each panel. You can actually just use a different fabric for each one. It just depends how patchy and what kind of look you're going for. You can make the spine a different fabric to the front and back. It's completely up to you, and you can really explore different design ideas with this as well. But you can see here I'm using my sewing machine and I'm using a straight stitch around the edges, and I have the panels facing up so that I can see the corners where all of the fabric sort of folded and bunched together, and that way I can see exactly what I'm doing and I can make sure that things are sitting nice and flat. You also just want to make sure that you're back stitching at the beginning and ends each time that you are sewing, just to make sure that it's not going to come undone. And you may need to play around with your tension just to make sure that your settings on your machine are correct for the amount of bulk you're putting through your machine. I personally find that the felt is really easy to sew with, and I haven't really encountered any issues with the bulk. So here you can see I have each panel sewn with the base fabric. So this is going to again make the edges of the journal look really nice, and it's going to give me a nice base to layer up upon. And so I'm going to take other little fun bits of fabric and trims and embroideries, and I'm just going to play around with the design until I come up with something that I like. And again, this is the fun part, and this can take a really long time because there's so many different ways that you could do this, and that's really the fun of it. And I spent a really long time coming up with this layout, so I didn't film all of it for you, but this is what each panel kind of looks like on my desk. So I've got my front, my back, and my spine, and again we're working in 3 different panels, so they're not sewn together at this point. And I'm going to start stitching all of those layers of fabric on using my sewing machine. And again, I'm going to use a straight stitch on my sewing machine, and you just have to kind of just figure out the order in which to sew each piece on because they are layered up on each other. I'm also folding in some of the raw edges of the fabric as I'm doing this so that I'm creating little seams so I don't have lots of raw fabric that can fray later on. Sometimes you do encounter a little piece of fabric or trim that is going to be raw, and I'll show you how we can fix that later. So the back's looking a little bit messy, but the front's looking great, and we're only worried about the front at this point in time. For the spine piece, I'm just trimming off some of that excess scrap fabric on the edge, and here you can see what the spine is looking like. Now I'm just going to repeat the steps for the front and back cover by stitching all of those decorative pieces of fabric on top. So here you can see each piece is pretty much finished, and here you can see some of the little raw edges, like the trim bits here where I haven't managed to fold them under, or I've just got like a raw cut. And so to stop those from fraying, further, I'm just taking some craft glue. This is just PVA glue. I'm just taking a little bit on my finger and I'm just going to rub that on those raw little bits of trim or fabric. You can do this for fabric as well. It will dry feeling a little bit crispy, so you don't want to do too much, but it's better than having it come unraveled. So once that's dry, I then trimmed off the excess little bits of trim, and now we're going to sew our cover together. So we're going to sew with the front and back cover slightly overlapping the spine piece, and I'm using a straight stitch to slowly and carefully sew the pieces together. Again, you may have to adjust your tension, it just depends on your machine. I just like to go nice and slow when I'm doing this part because there's additional bulk when you're sewing so many layers of fabric and felt together. So just go nice and slow. My machine gets through it pretty easily. So I'm doing the same with the back cover, and you just want to make sure that your pieces are sitting as neatly as they can. You don't want them to be kind of on an angle, or you just want them to sit nice and neatly and evenly the whole way down. Sometimes if your machine is having trouble, it's a good idea to make the length of your stitch a little bit longer, as well as adjusting the tension. And for the super bulky parts, you can even kind of manually push your needle through with the wheel. But here we have my journal taking shape. And you can see I've lost that little bit of width in the spine by the time I've stitched the 3 panels together. So now the outside of our cover is looking good, and we need to finish the inside cover because you can see all the stitching. We've got some raw felt that you can see. So I've taken a new piece of large fabric and I'm just cutting this out so that it's a little bit bigger than the entire cover itself. So I just lay the cover down on top of the fabric and I cut this out so that it has a bit of a border to work with. My fabric also needed a really light little press because it had some deep wrinkles in it, so I just did a light press. I wasn't too fussed about getting them out completely because this is my own book. And then I took out some pins and I'm just going to pin the fabric to the journal cover. You want it obviously to be facing the right way so that you're going to have that beautiful fabric showing in the end. I'm just putting a pin on each corner of the book, and then again I'm going to use a straight stitch and I'm going to sew all around the edge of the journal cover in one big piece. And I have my journal cover facing up as I do this so that I can see that I'm staying on top of the cover and not coming off the edge by accident. And I can make sure my stitches are looking nice and neat. And I can also go slowly where there's additional bulk. I can kind of see a little bit better where all of the fabric is and just make sure these stitches are as neat as possible. I'm just going as close as I can to the edge of the book and I'm going around the entire length. The bulkiest part is where the front and back cover overlaps the spine piece. Again, make sure you do reverse stitching at the start and the end of your stitches. And here we have our lining fabric all stitched on. I'm going to trim this down a little bit more, but I'm going to leave again just a little bit of a border. I don't want to cut this off flush and neat yet because we're going to have some fraying if we do that. So we will come back and finish that off a little bit better later on. Before we get to that though, I want to add some more stitches down the side of the spine of the book on both sides. And this time I have changed my settings to a zigzag stitch and I'm going to go nice and slow down again where the spine and the cover meets. So just going nice and slowly. This is going to help add that extra strength. It's going to add another layer of stitching. It's also going to help the fabric to sit a bit more flush and neatly. So here's what it looks like on the inside. And on the outside, it's just holding everything together a little bit neater. So I'm going to repeat that on the other side as well. What this also does is on the inside of your book, it shows you a really clear area where your spine is. So when it comes to binding your pages in, you can see where you need to bind within. There's no guesswork. It's a very clear little guide of where your spine is. And it also helps the lining fabric to sit nice and flush without having lots of like bumps and bubbles. So now we are almost finished with our cover. We just need to finish up the edging. So to do that, I'm taking again my craft glue and I'm going to put some craft glue around the raw edges of this fabric. So I'm placing the glue where the stitches are that we just sewed around the edges. And then I'm using my brush and I'm just kind of working the glue outwards towards the edge of the fabric, and this is just going to add a really small layer of glue on the raw edges and that raw border of the fabric that's around the edge of the book. So I'm doing this before I cut the fabric flush and neat because it just gives me a little bit more fabric to work with, and it's just going to make the ending result that little bit neater and easier. So you want to let this glue dry completely before you cut off the excess. So I let it dry for a couple of hours, and then I came back with my scissors and I'm just going to cut off that excess fabric as neatly as I can so that it's flush with the front cover. You want to be careful, of course, that you're not going to cut into the front cover, so just go nice and slowly and cut off that excess. And that fabric will now be nice and secure. It's not going to fray because it's got that little bit of glue where the stitches are and all the way to the edges of your book cover. And here we have our finished cover, and I'm telling you, these kind of covers just feel so nice to hold. They flex really well, so you can add a lot of pages, you can add a lot of photos, a lot of bulk to your journal, and it just has that flexibility to wrap around all of that stuff that you put inside. There's so many different options to play with, and I'm just really loving this process at the moment. So I hope that this was helpful if you were waiting for a tutorial on this type of book. I hope that this makes sense, and I hope that you will have a go at it. Please do let me know if you get stuck or if you have any questions that I haven't answered in this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again really soon in my next video.